Hello and welcome once more to the Reading Room. In this episode I spend most of the interview talking with my guest about another writer, but not just any writer, undoubtedly Hull's most famous poet. Today I'm joined by James Booth, retired academic and renowned expert on the poet Philip Larkin. He's edited some of Larkin's posthumous works and has written several books and papers on Larkin's life and work. Now James, when I first arrived in Hull, and it was the mid-80s, so it was near the end of Larkin's life, I'd say there weren't really any Larkin experts. There were Larkin colleagues, they were friends, they were definitely fans. I was one of the fans that came to Hull because Larkin was here. Tell us about that journey from being someone who knew Larkin and was a Larkin colleague to someone who becomes a Larkin scholar.
I knew and loved Larkin's poetry since I was at school, actually. And that in itself was a passion. So I would sit in Loughton Hall, where I was deputy warden, looking over the cricket pitch on a Sunday afternoon as it got dark in the autumn and as the winter came on, listening to the records that Larkin made of The Less Deceived and The Whitsun Weddings, and enjoying them in that beautiful melancholic way that his poetry works. And then I knew that the librarian was him, and I just noticed in a diary I kept at the time, I'd noted, I've just had a fine notice from the greatest poet in England at the time, you know. So I was aware of it, and I knew he was a good poet. On the other hand, academically, as you've suggested really, he wasn't in the frame. You thought, the great poets are T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. I mean, who would say he was a great poet now? Who were modernists who were going forward, whereas Larkin was old-fashioned, too English really. One felt a bit guilty about it. So it's only gradually, really after Larkin died, I think, that it slowly dawned on me that the old idea that his contemporaries had of him, that he was conservative, he wasn't as lively and as urgent as Alvarez said, as Ted Hughes, or as rooted as Heaney, was really outdated. You read a lot of poetry of the 50s and 60s now, it's very, very dated, whereas Larkin's poetry doesn't seem to have dated. So all of a sudden, we were actually teaching Larkin, and I started a module on him, but it was only after he was dead. And while he was alive, he really didn't have much to do with the English department. He kept his distance.
Yeah. Now, Larkin didn't really come to Hull till he was, very early 30s?
Yes. And
the debate that I have with people is Larkin a Hull poet?
There is a peculiar neutral attitude towards place. There's that famous early poem which he wrote just before he came to Hull and might not have written later on, actually. No, I have never found the place where I can say this is my proper ground, here I shall stay. 1954, I think. He came to Hull in 55. And perhaps this is where the revision of my attitude has come, really. He did, over the years, and particularly at the very beginning, I think, relate quite closely and intensely to this place. It gave him a protection that he wanted from the duties that he had as a son and as a lover to Monica Jones and his mother, who were down in the Midlands. So that's why I think he liked being on the edge of things in Hull. It's so far away.
He was responsible for a poetic and a literary legacy in Hull. And I'm thinking of the poets that came to Hull because of him, Douglas Dunn being one of them, Andrew Motion.
Yes, Sean O'Brien. And there's Pete Didsbury as well, who's still here, who is highly regarded by other poets. And
lots of people come to Hull because of Larkin. I think he was within his first year as a librarian. I read in your book that someone came to visit.
Yes.
They came to an interview.
That's right.
Simply so they could meet Philip Larkin, and then ended up getting a post in the library.
Yes, that's Mary Wrench.
Yes. So within a year of him actually arriving in Hull, there were people coming to Hull because he's because he's in Hull. Now it's nearing 30 years since he died. What of that legacy is left in Hull?
like all really great poets, the legacy is desperately ambiguous. One thinks of Milton particularly. So many poets for the next 150 years tried to write Miltonic blank verse, and they usually came a complete cropper. It's only when you get the Prelude by Wordsworth, which is actually coming straight on from it, but it's only when culture, when sensibilities have moved on significantly, that you can start to do something different. And the problem is Larkin's voice is so powerful that it's very difficult not to write in a Larkin-esque way. If you started to write a poem about a hedgehog, or about your parents, or about the Second World War, immediately you've got the classic poem by Larkin. And perhaps things have moved on now, but nevertheless, there are poets who have written not dissimilar poetry with the same kind of feeling and evoked things about Hull. I think it's at its best when it's something like Sean O'Brien, who really does his own thing. He has his own kind of political perspectives and a different style. But there's lots of echoes of Larkin in him, and he would admit it. I suppose the person who's most comparable, he is not in Hull actually. It's Anthony Thwaite, the president of the Larkin Society, who was Larkin's friend from way back. First came across in 1958, I think, and he of course was published by the Marvell Press even before he met Larkin. The same press has published The Less Deceived, which is a little Hull press run by...
if I remember right, this was something that I wasn't expecting, was that Larkin was published by a Hull press before he'd even thought about coming to Hull. It's
a weird story, and very, very strange the way it happened. He should have been published by Faber, and all kinds of accidents happened. One of which was he sent Church-Going to The Spectator, and they lost it for a year. And as soon as it got into The Spectator in 1955, the man at Faber who knew about Larkin, because they'd rejected his work in 1948, they'd seen him in the magazines ever since, and no doubt they were realising they'd made a mistake. They should have. Charles Monteith wrote to Larkin as soon as the Spectator poem came out saying, can we publish a volume of your work? A few months earlier than that, Larkin had finally lost patience. He'd been so set back by the rejection of his poems In the Grip of Light in 1948 by Faber, Methuen, and 4 other publishers. 6 publishers turned him down. And he'd self-published XX Poems in Belfast, which only got 1 review and was unnoted, but which actually got great poetry in it. So when he got The Less Deceived together, he didn't want to be disappointed, and he was so fundamentally self-doubting in a way as well. And so he noticed that he'd been published in this new magazine set up by George Hartley and his wife Jean, who are a working class couple in Hull. And they wrote to him and said, we're thinking of a volume and we like your poetry better than any other that we've had. Could you be it? And he thought about it and he said, shall I get a bloody nose off Faber again? No, I'll give it to them. So he did. So when Monteith wrote to him, it was too late. He'd already signed a contract with George Hartley. By a peculiar accident, the job came up in Hull at the library, and he applied for it. And he wrote, this is so amusing when you think of the Toads. You think of the Toads, and how popular they were, and how much they focused stuff on Hull, how good they'd been for Hull. The one thing he was really worried about when before The Less Deceived came out was that George and Jean Hartley should not let any local bookshops have copies to sell in case anyone on the appointing committee for his job read Toads. Because if they read Toads, they wouldn't give him the job. You know, why should I let the toad work squat on my life? Why can't I use a pitchfork to drive the brute off 6 days of the week? It soils with its sickening poison just for paying a few bills. That's out of proportion. Well, if you'd been on the appointing committee in 1955...
Yes, that would have been the end of his interview, wouldn't it? Yes.
So it really is one of the great amusing stories of literature, actually, that.
But I wonder if it kind of reflects in some ways, Hull's poetic tradition, which is very strong, and I think it does predate Larkin.
And of course they called it the Marvell Press, partly after Andrew Marvell, who is just as great a poet as Larkin actually in the 17th century, but rather less accessible to a lot of readers now. They named it after Marvell, and also because it would be a bloody marvel if it succeeded. There's a literary tradition in Hull, not just poetry, which is far more impressive than, say, Manchester or other northern. I think we are peculiarly well endowed, particularly in poetry.
Yes.
But of course, there's also Winifred Holtby, who, if she hadn't died so young, would have been a really significant novelist, and is a significant novelist because of South Riding. Certainly, I've always felt, ever since I arrived in the English department in Hull, that Hull was a very literary place. Partly because, as Larkin said, there's not so much crap around in Hull as there might be in London or other university cities. It's unassuming, it's got its own, and in his own mind, I think that connects up with the beautiful vista of to the east of Hull, across to Spurn and the Skye and so on, which he puts at the end of here, which is intensely poetic. And he only went there a couple of times, I think. But as he says, you needn't see it for 10 years, but it's there in your mind. Past the poppies, bluish neutral distance, ends the land suddenly in a beach of shapes and shingle. Here is unfenced existence, facing the sun, untalkative, out of reach.
Join us in part 2 when we talk about Larkin the man and the response to James Booth's literary biography of this poet. I decided, I don't know, whether it be 20 years ago now, right, I need to get Larkin's books in volumes, no more of the collected poems. And I'm in a second-hand bookshop and I spot a copy of The Whitsun Weddings and I think, excellent, that's going to be £5 well spent. And the woman in the shop, and she's selling me the book, says, "Oh, Larkin, you don't want any of Larkin, he's misogynistic."
Yes.
Is any of that justified?
No. Certainly the misogyny, absolutely not. Since my book's come out, I've received several letters from people who knew Larkin. And the most interesting thing, I think, is that not a single one of them says a word against him. They all found him a lovely man to have known, which is a bit surprising. You'd think if there was any truth at all in the idea that he was a nasty bastard and he cut people dead and was rude to people and whatever, he wasn't. He was absolutely charming to everybody he met, and he felt guilty if he wasn't, and would bend over backwards to help them. But also, say, looking at Monica, getting to the bottom of that relationship, there are 2 or 3 people who've written to me basically saying how they couldn't understand why he was together with Monica. She was loud, she drank too much, she'd turn up to dinner and spoil the whole thing by talking all the way through in a loud voice and not letting anyone, she didn't take any notice of other people. Yet he was doggedly loyal to her all the way through their life. And his relationship with Maeve has a delicacy and a bloom to it. He gave her a present, and you hear her description of it, of a pearl necklace which she wore. In fact, I sat next to her when she wore it at a performance of Larkin with Women by Ben Brown, this episode where he gave it. And it moved her deeply. She was so filled with the kind of romantic sense of this occasion. And obviously he understood that and he'd built it up. He was a sentimentalist deep down, I think. And women loved him. Apart from Monica, who became a recluse after his death, all the women in his life who were still alive when he died either became members of the Larkin Society or officers on the committee, or they wrote stuff for the Larkin Society Journal.
Now, your book, apart from loving reading the book, what I found really interesting was the response to the book.
Yes.
Lots of people who, on closer interrogation, could not follow up the statements that we're making, saying that for some reason you wanted to reassess Larkin's life, that you were being a revisionist, that you were going against accepted truth. Now, I've yet to find anybody that says, yes, Larkin was a bad person and this is why. It seems that somewhere along the line there's become an accepted truth. Has your book started to tip the balance towards a more reasonable approach to Larkin's life and work?
I very much hope so. One of the most difficult things in writing it, and if you'd have seen some of the earlier drafts, you'd realise this, was to avoid any hectic, over-argumentative, revisionist tone. There are little touches of it here and there, but I realised that if the book was really going to have the impact, I had to address the Larkin that I saw and knew. And the unfortunate fact was that the caricature in the press was totally inaccurate and based on nothing, not based on any real evidence at all. And the one thing which people kept coming back to, which is significant, is the so-called racism. Because that's the one thing where you can actually nail him. He did write in a letter to a couple of his friends, his right-wing friends, one of whom was a real right-winger, Gunner. He wrote, have you read my recipe for the next election? Prison for strikers, bring back the cat of nine tails, kick out the niggers, how about that? Yeah. So that's his recipe for winning the next election. And in a sense, if you look at that election, you see how completely accurate it is. It's absolutely brilliant. It really is brilliant. And so much more poignant than anything that Conquest or Gunner would have written themselves. Although they were really, right-wing ideologically. Larkin, I don't think, was. As you say, later in life, partly I think under the influence of Monica, who was pretty prejudiced, and Amos and Conquest and so on. And also out of a sort of perversity and a deliberate attempt not to do what was required of him, he took on a kind of right-wing persona, particularly in some of the essays. But it is a persona, and it's funny. I like to think of myself as quite funny, he says, as the first thing in the famous interview with the...
And it's one of the misunderstood things about Larkin is that he was witty, and he had an incredible dry wit.
The nicest review comment that I've had was from Clive James, who said that one of the good things about my book is that I understand Larkin's jokes. And so many critics, particularly, he says, Americans, I couldn't possibly comment, don't. They simply take it at face value. Now, Larkin, I think you could say that he did have some fairly mechanical Enoch Powell-like prejudices by the 70s and 80s. Earlier in his life, for instance, he based A Girl in Winter on a friend of his. I'm beginning to find out more about her, actually. She just died, called Miriam Plaut, who was a displaced German Jew in Oxford, and who fired up his imagination. He writes a novel where she isn't Jewish, she hasn't got a nationality. But when you realise that she was, and sort of read between the lines, you can see all kinds of things about that novel, make sense in relation to her. So I don't think he was in the slightest bit prejudiced in that kind of way. And of course, there's the well-known fact that he thought that Louis Armstrong was a greater artist than Picasso. More important in the 20th century. And his passion for black jazz was beyond anybody's. If you read through all what jazz, unfortunately jazz is a bit of a minority interest, so people don't know it. And there's not a hint of any racism in it. There's perhaps, and I think one does have to say this, in his reaction to Miles Davis and Coltrane, the modern jazz people, he did get onto a political tack there. He thought of them as being like the Black Panther movement, as being motivated by a hatred of whites and a deliberate attempt to distinguish themselves from whites. I think he's wrong, actually, and I think he almost knew he was, and he will sometimes step back and say, mine is not the only ear in the world. He's not as because he says so many things decisively. You can quote them, and it sounds as though he's absolutely 100% that way. But then you see other quotes and other things. You realise that he's always putting whatever opinion, whatever angle he's taking on the world in the most pithy, pungent, poignant way he can, and that's why he's a great writer.
Yeah. Now, the very last thing I would like you to do. There are some viewers that are hopefully from listening to this interview and watching this interview going to want to go and start reading some poems. Hopefully some people that are familiar with Larkin are going to want to come to the book, and it is absolutely worth a read. Can you name one poem that you would like to, Would you like to name one poem that you would recommend to a new reader of Larkin?
Well, I suppose if you want to give a reader the full classic Larkin, which is not so negative that one could say O'Bard, but then no, one would have to say The Whitsun Weddings. It's a poem which he comes closest to being, in which he is genuinely, warmly, empathetically engaged with the whole busy scene of domestic social life. He gets on the train at Hull, as the beautiful statue by Martin Jennings in Hull shows him at the beginning of that poem, dashing to get his train. I was late getting away that Monday. In the sort of rather the kind of small version of an ivory tower, I suppose, behind the glass of the windows, on the way to London to do what? To go to see the cricket, to go to a meeting of the Librarian Association. He doesn't tell you, it's not relevant. But in those hours where he's on the train, those moments passing, he sees the newly married couples who always used to get married at Whitsun because of some reason or other. It's Pentecostal as well, isn't it? He's not a religious poet, but it does help. There's a slight sacramental kind of element to the poem. And they're all getting married, and he gives these delightful descriptions of them getting on the train, and the bridesmaids in peculiar coloured olive ochres and so on, and the uncles shouting smut and so on. And you think, is this patronising? No, it's not actually. It's actually, he doesn't feel he's superior or fundamentally different from them. And as he approaches London, he feels that the whole train with all these newly married couples going off on their honeymoons is contributing to the busy life of London with its postal districts packed like sheaves of wheat, and then the rain comes, and you feel it's an absolutely gorgeous poem, and very positive. I mean, there's almost nothing negative in it at all. In fact, there isn't anything negative in it, and empathetic, which is the key to Larkin, I think. Really, he's always ready to see the common humanity he has with other people, whether it's people, women at moustached women at a faith healing, wanting to pathetically to believe in God, or whether it's a rabbit with myxomatosis in a field not knowing what's going on, or whether it's a lamb newborn, or whether it's a jazz enthusiast listening to Bechet's clarinet sort of soaring to an enormous yes. I mean, positive, that's as positive as you can get. An enormous yes. It's one of his great well-known phrases.
Philip Larkin seems like a difficult poet to love until you read his work and realise the clichés are mostly untrue. And James Booth has proven that the same can be said of the man. If you want to find out more about this poet's life and work, visit philiplarkin.com, the website of the Philip Larkin Society. There you'll find news, features and information on the regular events run by the Society. This series is made possible by the support of the James Reckitt Library Trust.